He thought his platinum status was a shield. He thought his Italian suit was a weapon. But mostly, Preston Vance thought the color of a man's skin dictated his net worth. When he boarded Sovereign Air Flight 902, he saw a quiet black man in a hoodie sitting in seat 1A, the most coveted spot on the plane, and decided that a mistake had been made. He didn't know that the man he was mocking wasn't just a passenger. He was the architect of the very airline they were flying on. What started as a sneer ended in a federal ban, a viral video, and the kind of karma that ruins lives in mere seconds. This is the story of how silence can be the loudest sound in the world. The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin of Sovereign Air Flight 902 was specifically engineered for silence. The lighting was a soft, biorhythmic amber, designed to soothe the circadian rhythms of the ultra-wealthy as they prepared for the 7-hour hop from JFK to London Heathrow. The seats weren't just chairs, they were private suites, enclosed in hand-stitched Italian leather and brushed aluminum, costing roughly $12,000 for a one-way ticket. In Suite 1A, the prime real estate of the aircraft, sat Julian Thorne. To the untrained eye, Julian looked like an anomaly in this environment. He was a black man in his early 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard, wearing a generic heather-grey zipper hoodie, dark denim jeans that had seen better days, and a pair of canvas sneakers. He wasn't typing furiously on a MacBook Pro or swirling a glass of pre-departure Dom Perignon. Instead, he was deeply engrossed in a battered paperback book, a vintage copy of the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. He had a pair of noise-cancelling headphones resting around his neck, but they were turned off. He was simply existing, projecting an aura of absolute stillness that usually takes monks decades to master. Julian loved this route. It was the flagship route of the company, and he often flew it deadhead, or at least anonymously, to check on the service quality. He didn't want the red carpet. He wanted the truth. He wanted to know if the coffee was actually hot, if the flight attendants were actually happy, and if the new cabin pressure system he'd spent millions approving was actually reducing jet lag. The peace of the cabin was shattered at 6:45 p.m. exactly. I'm just saying, if I pay 15 grand for a ticket, I expect there to be overhead bin space for my garment bag, Sarah. Is it Sarah? You look like a Sarah. The voice was booming, nasally, and carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who hadn't heard the word no since the mid-1990s. Enter Preston Vance. Preston was a caricature of corporate excess. He was a man in his late 50s, red-faced and perspiring slightly, despite the cool air of the cabin. He wore a suit that screamed its price tag, a pinstriped bespoke piece that was tight around the midsection, and a gold watch the size of a hockey puck. He was dragging a Louis Vuitton roller bag that was clearly too large for the overhead compartment, yet he was shoving it in with the grace of a battering ram. Trailing behind him was his wife, Cynthia, a woman who looked like she had permanently apologized for her husband's existence for the last 20 years. She kept her head down, clutching a Prada handbag, avoiding eye contact with the flight crew. "Sir," the flight attendant, whose name tag actually read Elena, said with strained politeness, "Let me assist you with that. We can check it at the gate if it doesn't fit." "Check it?" Preston scoffed, whipping his head around. "Do I look like I check bags, honey? My suits cost more than your annual salary. I'm not having some baggage handler in Queens play soccer with my wardrobe. Push it in." Elena, a veteran of the skies with infinite patience, stepped forward to help rearrange the bins. Preston finally turned away from the struggle with the luggage and looked toward the seating area. He scanned the cabin, asserting his dominance, nodding at a recognizable tech CEO in row 2, offering a sleazy wink to a model in row 3. Then his eyes landed on Suite 1A. He stopped, His smile vanished, replaced by a look of genuine confusion, followed immediately by a sneer of disgust. "You've got to be kidding me," Preston muttered, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. He walked over to his assigned seat, 1B, which was directly across the aisle from Julian. Preston didn't sit down immediately. He stood in the aisle, looming over the partition, staring directly at Julian. Julian didn't look up. He turned a page of his book. "Excuse me," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. Julian continued reading. "Hey, buddy, I'm talking to you," Preston said, louder this time. He reached out and tapped the privacy shell of Julian's suite with his knuckles. Rap, rap, rap. Julian slowly lifted his head. His eyes were dark, calm, and unbothered. He slid his headphones off his neck and placed them on the side table. "Can I help you?" Julian asked. His voice was a deep, smooth baritone, controlled and precise. Preston laughed, a short, barking sound. "Yeah, I think you can. You're in 1A. "I am," Julian agreed. "That's interesting," Preston said, looking around the cabin as if looking for an audience. "Usually the airline blocks that seat for VVIPs or, people who actually paid full fare." "Is that so?" Julian asked, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, that's so." Preston leaned in, his cologne, a heavy, musky scent, wafting into Julian's personal space. "Look, I don't know how you got the upgrade. Maybe you used miles. Maybe you're an employee's cousin or something. But my wife and I are traveling together. She's back in 4B. I want her up here with me." "That's nice," Julian said. "I hope you have a pleasant flight." Julian went back to his book. Preston stood there, his face turning a shade of crimson that matched the carpet in the terminal. He wasn't used to being dismissed. He was the CEO of Vance Global Logistics. He fired people for looking at him the wrong way. "I'm offering you a trade," Preston said, his voice taking on a harder edge. 4B is a great seat. Window. Still first class. You move back there, my wife takes 1A, and I'll give you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a money clip. $200 for the trouble. Go buy yourself some new headphones. Julian didn't look up from the page. "No, thank you." $500, Preston snapped. "The seat isn't for sale," Julian said softly. Preston scoffed, turning to look at Eleanor, who was approaching with a tray of pre-flight beverages. "Miss," Preston barked, "we have a situation here." Eleanor froze. She knew exactly who Julian was. Every crew member on the Sovereign Air roster had memorized Julian Thorne's face, even though he rarely flew under his own name. The manifest listed him as J.T. King, a pseudonym he used to avoid fuss. But Eleanor knew. She knew that the man in the hoodie had personally signed the check for her daughter's scoliosis surgery through the company's benevolence fund last year. She looked from the red-faced Preston to the calm Julian. "Is there a problem, Mr. Vance?" Elena asked, keeping her voice steady. "Yes, there's a problem." Preston pointed a thick finger at Julian. "This individual is refusing to accommodate a reasonable request. I want my wife in 1A. He's clearly out of his element here. Look at him. It's making the other passengers uncomfortable." The cabin was silent. The tech CEO in row 2 was watching over his glasses. The model in row 3 had taken out her phone. "Mr. Vance," Elena said firmly, "Mr. King has assigned seat 1A. The flight is fully booked. I cannot ask him to move." "Mr. King?" Preston laughed, a cruel, mocking sound. "King of what? The burger joint? Look, I know how these things work. You guys fill the empty seats with non-revenue passengers. Affirmative action upgrades, right? Gotta meet the quota." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby seats. Julian closed his book. He closed it very slowly. He placed it on the tray table. He looked at Preston Vance, and for the first time, There was a glimmer of something dangerous in his eyes. Not anger. Something colder. "I would be very careful with your next few words," Julian said. Preston Vance did not take the warning. Men like Preston Vance never saw the cliff until they were already falling. To him, Julian's calmness wasn't a sign of power. It was a sign of submission. In Preston's world, the loudest dog was the leader of the pack, and Julian was being far too quiet. "Careful?" Preston chuckled, loosening his tie as he settled into seat 1B, turning his body so he could fully face Julian across the aisle. "Or what, pal? You gonna pull a card on me? You gonna rap about your struggles?" Cynthia, Preston's wife, appeared at his shoulder. "Preston, please," she whispered, her face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. "It's fine. I like seat 4B. It's quiet back there. Please, just sit down." "No, Cyn. It's the principle of the thing." Preston waved her off without looking at her. "We pay premium prices for a premium environment. I don't pay 12 grand to sit next to someone who looks like he just hopped the turnstile in the Bronx." He turned back to Julian. "Hey, seriously, how did you afford this? Drug money? Lottery ticket? Settlement check?" Julian turned his body entirely toward Preston. He sat with perfect posture. "I work for a living, just like you." "Like me?" Preston howled. "Buddy, you are nothing like me. I run a logistics empire. I move steel and microchips across oceans. I have 300 people whose livelihoods depend on whether I had a good breakfast. What do you do? Do you even have a job? Or are you just a professional traveler?" "I manage people," Julian said simply. "Manage people? What, shift manager at a warehouse? Night shift security?" Preston shook his head, picking up the crystal glass of champagne Elena had placed on his console. He took a swig, swishing it around his mouth like mouthwash. "This champagne is warm, by the way," he shouted at Elena, who was 3 rows away. "Typical. Standards are slipping everywhere." He looked back at Julian. "See, that's the problem with the world today. Dilution of standards. They let anyone in anywhere. Used to be, first class was an exclusive club. Now, it's a charity ward." Julian picked up his own glass of water. "You seem very concerned with status, Mr. Vance." "Status is everything," Preston declared. "Status is the only thing that separates us from the animals. It's how we know who matters and who doesn't. And frankly, looking at you don't matter here. You're a glitch in the system." At this point, the passenger in 2A, the tech CEO named David, leaned forward. "Hey, guy," David said, addressing Preston. "Cool it, all right? You're disturbing the whole cabin." Preston whipped around. "Mind your business, Four Eyes. I'm having a conversation." "It's not a conversation," Julian said. "It's a monologue, and it's a boring one." Preston's face went purple. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. "You're loud, you're insecure, and you're projecting your own inadequacies onto everyone around you. You're terrified that if you stop shouting, people will realize you're actually quite small." The silence that followed was heavy. It hung in the air like smoke. Preston stood up. He actually unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up in the aisle, towering over Julian's seated form. This was a federal offense in the making, threatening behavior on an aircraft, but Preston was too far gone in his rage to care. "Listen to me, you little piece of—" Preston began, jabbing a finger toward Julian's face. Elena rushed forward. "Sir, sit down immediately. The cabin doors are closed. We are pushing back." "I want him off the plane!" Preston screamed, pointing at Julian. "I don't feel safe. He's aggressive. Did you hear him threaten me? He threatened me. I want him removed. I am a Platinum Medallion member, and I demand you remove this thug from the flight." Julian looked at Elena. He gave her a microscopic nod. It was a signal. "Do not engage. Let him dig." Sir, Elena said, her voice shaking slightly but holding firm. Mr. King has done nothing wrong. You are the one causing a disturbance. If you do not sit down, I will have to contact the captain. Call the captain, Preston yelled. Go ahead. Captain Miller and I go way back. I've flown this airline for 10 years. I know the CEO. Heck, I've played golf with the VPs. You call the captain, and I'll have your job and this guy's seat by the time we hit cruising altitude. Julian raised an eyebrow. You know the CEO? Personally, Preston lied. He lied with the confidence of a sociopath. Great guy. Hates this kind of stuff. He hates when the brand is tarnished by low-value individuals. If he knew you were sitting here ruining the aesthetic, he'd throw you out the airlock himself. Julian couldn't help it. A small, wry smile touched his lips. Is that a fact? That's a fact, Preston sneered. So why don't you save us all the trouble, grab your little backpack, and march your ass back to economy where you belong? Maybe there's an empty middle seat near the toilets. Julian sighed. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie. Preston flinched. He's got a gun. He's reaching for something. Passengers gasped. Someone in the back screamed. Julian slowly pulled out a sleek black smartphone. It wasn't a standard iPhone. It was a secure satellite device used by top-tier executives. He tapped the screen twice. What are you doing? Preston demanded, sweat beading on his forehead. Calling your boys? I'm sending a text, Julian said calmly. To who? Your lawyer, Preston mocked. To the cockpit, Julian said. Preston froze. What? The cockpit, Julian repeated. You said you wanted to talk to Captain Miller. I'm saving Elena the walk. Preston blinked, his brain trying to process the absurdity of the statement. You're texting the pilot. Sure, right. And I'm texting the President of the United States. Suddenly, the flight deck announcement chime rang out. Bing bong. Cabin crew, please prepare for gate return, a voice said over the PA system. It wasn't the generic flight attendant voice. It was the deep, authoritative voice of the captain. The plane, which had just begun its slow roll away from the gate, shuddered to a halt. The engine spooled down from a whine to a hum. Preston looked around, confused. Why are we stopping? What's going on? He looked at Julian. Julian was simply looking at his watch. We aren't taking off, Julian said, locking eyes with Preston. Not with you on board. Me? Preston laughed nervously. You think you did this? You're delusional. They probably have a mechanical issue, probably the weight distribution, because of your carry-on. The cockpit door at the front of the cabin clicked and hissed open. Usually, pilots never leave the flight deck once the doors are secured. It is a strict FAA regulation. But the plane wasn't moving, and they were technically still under the jurisdiction of the gate agents. Captain Miller stepped out. He was a tall man with silver hair and 4 gold stripes on his shoulder epaulets. He looked serious. He scanned the cabin. Preston puffed out his chest. Captain, thank God. This stewardess is incompetent, and this passenger is threatening me. I want them both reported. Captain Miller walked right past Preston. He didn't even look at him. He walked straight to Suite 1A. The entire cabin held its breath. Preston smirked, waiting for the eviction. Here it comes, he thought. Back to the ghetto. Captain Miller stopped in front of Julian. He snapped his heels together and offered a sharp, respectful salute. Mr. Thorne, the captain said, his voice clear and deferential. I received your message. I apologize for the disturbance. How do you wish to proceed? Preston's smirk fell off his face like wet cement. Mr. Thorne? Preston whispered. The name rattled around in his brain. Thorne. Sovereign heir. Julian Thorne. He looked at the man in the hoodie. He looked at the logo on the napkin under his drink. Sovereign heir. The color drained from Preston's face so fast it looked like he'd been embalmed. Julian looked up at the captain, then slowly turned his gaze to Preston. The silence in the cabin was now deafening. "Captain," Julian said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a guillotine blade. "Mr. Vance here claims to be a personal friend of the CEO. He claims the CEO would want low-value individuals removed from his aircraft." Julian stood up. He wasn't just a guy in a hoodie anymore. He stood tall, radiating an intensity that made the air feel thin. "I am the CEO," Julian said, "and I agree with Mr. Vance. We should remove the low-value individual who is ruining the flight for everyone else." For a solid 10 seconds, the only sound in the first-class cabin was the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic thumping of Preston Vance's heart. Preston looked at Captain Miller. He looked at the flight attendants, who were now standing with their arms crossed, expressions grim. Finally, he looked back at Julian Thorne. "You're joking," Preston stammered, his voice losing all its previous boom. He forced a wobbly smile. "This is a prank, right? Like a hidden camera show? You got me. Good one. I'm a funny guy. I can take a joke." Julian didn't smile. He didn't blink. He simply reached into his hoodie pocket again. Preston flinched and pulled out a black leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a heavy metal ID card with a holographic chip. It read, "Julian Thorne, Chief Executive Officer, Sovereign Air Group." "I assure you, Mr. Vance," Julian said, his voice cool and detached, "I don't have time for pranks, and I certainly don't have time for bigotry on my aircraft." Preston's face cycled through 3 emotions in rapid succession: denial, panic, and then a desperate, clawing anger. "Okay, look," Preston said, holding his hands up. "So you're the CIO. Great. Congratulations. A self-made man. I respect that. We were just having some banter. Men of industry, right? Iron sharpens iron. I was testing you." "You were harassing me," Julian corrected him. "You tried to bribe me. You insulted my appearance. You insulted my staff. And you attempted to use my own name, or who you thought I was, to intimidate me." Julian turned to the captain. "Captain Miller, this passenger is non-compliant and has created a hostile environment. I am designating him a security risk. Please have him removed." "Understood, sir," Captain Miller said. He lifted his radio. "Tower, this is Sovereign 902. We are returning to the gate, requesting Port Authority police to meet the aircraft. Disturbance in the first-class cabin." "Police?" Preston shrieked. "You're calling the cops? For what? Freedom of speech? I know my rights. You can't kick me off. I paid $12,000. "And I will personally see that it is refunded," Julian said. "And then I will ensure your name is added to our no-fly list. Permanently. You will never step foot on a sovereign airplane again. Not in New York, not in London, not in Tokyo." Preston lunged forward, grabbing the armrest of Julian's suite. "You can't do that. Do you know who I am? I have meetings in London tomorrow. Crucial meetings. If I miss them, I lose millions." "You should have thought about that before you decided to mock a stranger for reading a book," Julian replied. The plane lurched as the tug vehicle pushed them back toward the gate. The jet bridge began to extend. Preston turned to his wife. "Cynthia, do something. Tell them." Cynthia Vance sat in seat 4B. She had been watching the entire exchange with wide, terrified eyes. But as Preston yelled at her, something shifted in her expression. She looked at her husband, sweating, red-faced, screaming like a toddler. And then she looked at Julian, who was composed and dignified. "I told you to sit down, Preston," Cynthia whispered. "Don't you take his side," Preston roared. 2 Port Authority officers boarded the plane. They were large men with no sense of humor. They marched down the aisle, past the staring passengers. "Mr. Vance?" the lead officer asked. "This is a mistake," Preston shouted, pointing at Julian. "That man is the aggressor. He provoked me." "Sir, grab your bags," the officer said, reaching for Preston's arm. "Get your hands off me." Preston slapped the officer's hand away. That was the final nail in the coffin. "Okay, sir. You're under arrest for interference with a flight crew and assaulting an officer," the policeman said. In one fluid motion, he spun Preston around and slammed him against the bulkhead. The sound of handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the cabin. "Ouch! You're hurting me! Lawsuit! This is a lawsuit!" Preston screamed as they frog-marched him down the aisle. He passed the model in row 3. She was holding her phone up, recording everything. He passed the tech CEO in row 2. "Have a nice trip," the man said dryly. As they dragged Preston past Julian's seat, Preston dug his heels into the carpet. "You'll regret this, Thorne. I'll destroy this airline. I'll short your stock. I'll bury you." Julian didn't even look at him. He had already opened his book again. "Get him off my plane," he said softly. The officers hauled Preston onto the jet bridge, his screams fading as the heavy cabin door was shut and locked. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was a good silence. It was the silence of justice. Elena, the flight attendant, looked at Julian. She was shaking slightly. "Mr. Thorne, Thank you." Julian offered her a warm smile. "You handled that perfectly, Elena. Take a breath. We'll be underway shortly." Then Julian stood up and walked back to row 4. He stopped at seat 4B. Cynthia Vance was staring at her lap, tears streaming down her face. She looked up as Julian approached, flinching as if she expected him to yell at her too. "Mrs. Vance," Julian said gently. "I'm so sorry," Cynthia sobbed. "I'm so mortified. I'll get my bags. I'll get off. Please don't arrest me." Julian crouched down so he was at eye level with her. "Mrs. Vance, you haven't done anything wrong. You were polite and respectful. You are welcome to stay on this flight." Cynthia blinked, confused. "But my husband—" "Your husband is going to jail tonight," Julian said honestly, "and likely facing federal charges. There is nothing you can do for him right now. But the question is, do you want to go with him? Or do you want to go to London?" Cynthia looked at the empty seat where her husband had been. She thought about the 20 years of insults, the shouting, the embarrassment. She thought about the quiet weekend she had planned in Kensington. She took a deep breath. She wiped her eyes. "He has my passport in his bag," she whispered, a fresh wave of panic rising. Julian smiled. "Elena," he called out, "check Mr. Vance's bag in the jetway. Retrieve Mrs. Vance's passport." "Right away, sir." Julian turned back to Cynthia. "We'll get you that passport. And Mrs. Vance, I'm upgrading you to seat 1A. I think you'll find it much more comfortable." "But that's your seat," she gasped. "I have work to do in the cockpit anyway," Julian lied smoothly. "Please, take the suite. Enjoy the champagne. You look like you need a vacation." For the first time in years, Cynthia smiled. It was a small, fragile thing. But it was there. "Thank you," she whispered. The flight to London was smooth, but the turbulence on the ground was just beginning. While Flight 902 was cruising at 35,000 feet over the Atlantic, entirely disconnected from the world below, the digital realm was setting Preston Vance on fire. The model in row 3, whose name was Chloe, had a TikTok following of 2.4 million people. She hadn't just recorded the arrest. She had recorded the entire interaction from the moment Preston started shouting about the affirmative action upgrade. She uploaded the video with the caption, "Racist boomer tries to bully a black man in first class. Turns out the black man is the CEO of the airline. Instant karma. Sovereign Air Justice CEO. The video hit the algorithm like a meteor. 10 minutes, 50,000 views. 30 minutes, 500,000 views. The comment section was a war zone of support for Julian and vitriol for Preston. User 1. The way he switched up when he saw the ID. User 2. Who is this guy? Find him. The internet, do your thing. User 3. Julian Thorne is a legend. So calm, that's true power. 1 hour, 2.1 million views. The video jumped from TikTok to Twitter, X. The hashtag #FirstClassRacist began trending #1 in the United States. By the time Preston Vance was being processed at the Port Authority holding cell at JFK, stripped of his belt and shoelaces, his identity had been discovered. A Reddit user recognized him. That's Preston Vance, CEO of Vance Global Logistics, based in Chicago. I used to work for him. He's even worse in person. The doxing was swift and brutal. His LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments. His company's Instagram page was bombarded with clown emojis and demands for his resignation. But the real damage, the hard karma, was happening in the boardrooms. Vance Global Logistics was a publicly traded company. It relied heavily on contracts with international carriers to move freight. One of their biggest partners was Sovereign Cargo, a subsidiary of Sovereign Air. At 9:30 p.m. EST, while Preston was using his one phone call to scream at his lawyer, the stock market in Tokyo opened. Vance Global Logistics, VGL, took an immediate nosedive. The video had been translated into Japanese, and the Asian markets were reacting to the instability of the CEO. Back on the plane, the atmosphere was serene. Julian spent the first hour of the flight in the galley, talking to the crew, asking about their families. He wasn't hiding, he was working. He poured coffee, he helped plate the dinner service. When he finally returned to the cabin, he saw Cynthia in seat 1A. She was asleep. She was fully reclined, wrapped in the duvet, looking more peaceful than she had looked in decades. David, the tech CEO in row 2, caught Julian's eye. "Mr. Thorne," David whispered. "That was impressive." "It was necessary," Julian replied quietly. "I'm David Haskins," he said, extending a hand. "I run Nebulon Systems. We do cloud infrastructure. I've been trying to get a meeting with your CTO for months." Julian shook his hand. "Send me an email, David. I'll make sure he sees it. But only if you promise not to mention what happened here today. I don't want the publicity." "My lips are sealed," David promised. But he knew it was too late. He had connected to the in-flight Wi-Fi. He had seen the news. "Mr. Thorne," David said, looking at his phone, "I don't think you can avoid the publicity. You're trending higher than the Super Bowl right now." Julian sighed. He took his phone off airplane mode and connected to the Wi-Fi. His notifications were frozen, simply because there were too many coming in at once. Emails, texts, news alerts. CNN. Airline CEO confronts unruly passenger in viral video. BBC. Sovereign Air boss Julian Thorne praised for handling of racist incident. Fox Business. Vance Global Logistics stock tumbles after CEO arrested. Julian rubbed his temples. He hated the spotlight. He had spent 10 years building Sovereign Air by letting the work speak for itself. But as he looked at the frozen frame of the video, Preston's red, screaming face inches from his own calm demeanor, he realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was a symbol. He typed a quick text to his PR team on the ground. "Draft a statement. Zero tolerance policy. Focus on the safety of the crew and passengers. Do not mention Mr. Vance by name. Let the police handle him." He hit send, put his noise-cancelling headphones back on, and opened Marcus Aurelius again. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. He read that line twice, then he closed his eyes and went to sleep. Preston Vance was released on bail at 7 a.m. the next morning. He walked out of the precinct looking like a shattered man. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was missing, confiscated as a choking hazard, and he smelled like stale coffee and fear. He saw the wall of cameras before he even exited the doors. Paparazzi, news crews, independent streamers. They were camped out on the sidewalk. "Mr. Vance, do you have a comment on the video? Did you really try to bribe Julian Thorne? Are you resigning? Mr. Vance, look this way." Preston put his head down and pushed through the crowd, shielding his eyes. He spotted his lawyer's black SUV waiting at the curb. He dove into the back seat, slamming the door shut. "Drive!" he screamed. "Just drive!" His lawyer, a man named Stan who billed $800 an hour, turned around from the front seat. He didn't look sympathetic. He looked like a doctor delivering a terminal diagnosis. "We have a problem, Preston," Stan said. "Problem? Of course we have a problem," Preston shouted, his hands shaking as he patted his pockets for his phone. "I need to tweet. I need to put out a statement. I need to say it was taken out of context. It was a misunderstanding. Give me my phone." "Preston, listen to me," Stan said sharply. "Don't touch your phone." "Why?" Stan handed him a tablet. "This is your inbox." Preston looked at the screen. The first email was from the chairman of the board of Vance Global Logistics. The subject line was, "Emergency Board Resolution. Immediate effect." Preston felt his stomach drop. "What is this?" "They met at 4 a.m., Stan explained. "They held a vote. It was unanimous, Preston." Preston tapped the email. "Dear Mr. Vance, effective immediately, your employment as CEO of Vance Global Logistics is terminated for cause. Your actions, captured on video and verified by multiple witnesses, constitute a gross violation of the moral turpitude clause in your contract, Section 14b. You are stripped of your stock options. You are barred from the premises. Security has been instructed to pack your personal effects and ship them to your residence. Do not contact any employees. Do not speak to the press on behalf of the company. Regrettably, the board of directors." "They can't do this," Preston whispered. "I built that company. It's mine." "It's a public company," Stan said. "And you just tanked the share price by 18% in 12 hours. You're radioactive, Preston. No one wants to touch you." Preston slumped back against the leather seat. 18%. "It gets worse," Stan said. He swiped the screen. Sovereign Air issued a statement an hour ago. They are cancelling the cargo contract with VGL. That contract is worth $400 million a year. Other airlines are following suit. United, Delta, British Airways. They're all reviewing their relationships with us. You haven't just ruined your career, Preston. You might have bankrupted the company." Preston stared out the tinted window. The New York skyline passed by, grey and unforgiving. "Where is Cynthia?" Preston asked, his voice hollow. "Call my wife. She'll fix this. She knows I'm not like that. She'll vouch for me." Stan hesitated. "Cynthia isn't answering her phone, Preston. She's probably on the plane. It lands in London in an hour. Call the concierge at the Savoy. Tell them to have her call me the second she checks in." "Preston," Stan said softly. "Cynthia isn't going to the Savoy." "What? Where is she going?" "She emailed me," Stan said. "She asked me to begin divorce proceedings immediately." Preston felt like he had been punched in the chest. Divorce? Over one flight? "She sent a video attachment," Stan said. "Do you want to see it?" Preston nodded numbly. Stan pressed play on the tablet. It was a video taken in the first-class cabin of Flight 902. Cynthia was sitting in seat 1A, holding a glass of champagne. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. "Preston," she said to the camera. For 20 years, you've made me feel small so you could feel big. You've controlled where I sit, what I eat, and what I say. Today, I watched a stranger treat me with more respect in 5 minutes than you have in 5 years. I'm not coming back. I'm going to London. I'm going to see the museums you never wanted to see. I'm going to eat the food you said was garbage. Do not come looking for me. My lawyer will talk to your lawyer. She raised the glass of champagne. Cheers. The video ended. Preston Vance sat in the back of the SUV, surrounded by the wreckage of his own ego. He was a millionaire, but in that moment, he had nothing. No job, no wife, no reputation. He looked down at his hands, the hands that had grabbed the officer, the hands that had pointed at Julian Thorne. His phone buzzed. It was a notification from his bank. Alert. Joint account ending in 4490. Withdrawal $500,000. Initiated by C. Vance. Preston closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath. The karma hadn't just hit, it had flattened him. The fall of a titan is rarely silent. It is usually a cacophony of lawsuits, breaking news alerts, and the sound of doors slamming shut. For Preston Vance, the months following the incident on Flight 902 were not just a decline. They were a dissection. The legal proceedings began 6 weeks after the arrest. The venue was the Queens County Criminal Court, a drab, fluorescent-lit building that smelled of floor wax and despair, a far cry from the mahogany boardrooms Preston was accustomed to. He sat at the defendant's table, looking noticeably thinner. His bespoke suits were gone, replaced by an off-the-rack charcoal ensemble that fit poorly around the shoulders. His lawyer, Stan, had resigned, citing irreconcilable conflicts of interest, which was legalese for your check bounced, leaving Preston with a court-appointed public defender named Marcus, a young, overworked attorney who had zero patience for Preston's entitlement. Mr. Vance, Judge Harrison said, peering over her spectacles. She was a stern woman who had seen everything the city of New York had to throw at her, and she was unimpressed by the fallen CEO. You are charged with interference with a flight crew, simple assault and disorderly conduct. The evidence against you is substantial. It was stress, Your Honor, Preston blurted out, ignoring Marcus's hand on his arm. I was under immense pressure. The airline provoked me. That man, Mr. Thorne, he entrapped me. The courtroom groaned. Even the stenographer rolled her eyes. Mr. Vance, Judge Harrison said, her voice like granite. I have watched the video. The whole world has watched the video. You weren't entrapped. You were entitled. You treated a fellow human being as furniture because you assumed you were better than him. And when you found out you weren't, you resorted to violence. The gavel came down hard. Preston avoided jail time, barely, due to it being a first offense, but the sentence was a humiliator's dream. 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, mandatory anger management therapy twice a week, and a fine of $50,000 paid to the Port Authority. But the courtroom was just the prelude. The real punishment waited outside. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Without the high-powered lawyers he could no longer afford, Preston was decimated. Cynthia didn't just want out. She wanted reparations for 20 years of emotional suppression. The judge awarded her the house in the Hamptons, the primary liquidity of their savings, and 40% of his future earnings, assuming he ever had any. Preston was forced to sell the penthouse in Manhattan. He moved into a 1-bedroom apartment in Jersey City. It wasn't a slum, but for a man who used to drink wine that cost more than the monthly rent, it was a prison cell. The silence in his apartment was the worst part. His phone, which used to ring 200 times a day, sat on the cheap IKEA coffee table, dark and dormant. He tried to get back into the game. He sent out consulting proposals. He reached out to old contacts, men he had played golf with, men he had made rich. The number you have reached is no longer in service. Mr. Davis is in a meeting and cannot take your call. Look, Preston, don't call here again. It's bad for optics. He was radioactive. The video hadn't just gone viral. It had become a cultural touchstone. It was used in HR training videos on what not to do. It was referenced in stand-up comedy specials. Preston Vance had become a verb. To Vance, someone meant to arrogantly underestimate an opponent and immediately lose everything. The nadir came in November, 8 months after the flight. Preston needed money. His savings were bleeding out. He applied for a mid-level management position at a regional shipping company in Newark. It was a humiliating step down, a salary of $80,000 a year. But he was desperate. He walked into the interview wearing his one good remaining suit. The hiring manager was a woman in her 30s, sharp and professional. She looked at his resume. She looked at him. "Preston Vance," she said, tapping her pen on the desk. "Vance Global Logistics?" "Yes," Preston said, sitting up straighter, summoning the ghost of his old arrogance. "I built that company from the ground up. I know I'm overqualified for this role, but I'm looking for a new challenge. I can turn your supply chain around in 6 weeks." The woman turned her laptop screen around. It was paused on a YouTube video. The video. "Mr. Vance," she said quietly, "our company has a very strict diversity and inclusion policy. We have a zero-tolerance policy for harassment." "That was a misunderstanding," Preston pleaded, sweat pricking his forehead. "The media spun it. I'm a victim of cancel culture." "Sir," she said, standing up, "my brother is a flight attendant. He sent me this video the day it happened. We aren't hiring you. We wouldn't hire you to sweep the floors." She pointed to the door. "Please leave before I call security." Preston walked out of that office, into the cold November rain. He didn't have an umbrella. He walked to the bus stop. His BMW had been repossessed weeks ago, and sat on the wet bench. He looked at the puddles on the ground. He saw his reflection. Grey hair, wet and matted. Puffy eyes. A cheap suit soaked through. He thought about seat 1A. He thought about the warm amber lighting. He thought about the champagne he had complained was warm. He realized, finally, that the champagne hadn't been the problem. The problem was that he had been drunk on himself. And now he was sobering up, and the hangover was going to last for the rest of his life. 1 year later, London Heathrow Airport, the Sovereign Air First Class Lounge. This particular lounge was the jewel of Julian Thorne's empire. It didn't look like an airport terminal. It looked like a high-end library mixed with a spa. There was a grand piano playing soft jazz in the corner. There was a living wall of fresh botanicals to oxygenate the air. Julian Thorne sat in a private alcove, reviewing the quarterly reports. Sovereign Air was up 40%. The incident with Preston Vance, rather than being a scandal, had galvanized the public's trust in the airline. People wanted to fly with a company that stood up for dignity. They called it the Thorne effect. Julian was tired, but it was a good tired. He closed his laptop and signaled for a tea. "Julian." He froze. The voice was familiar, but different. Lighter. Happier. He turned around. Standing there was Cynthia Vance, but it wasn't the Cynthia he remembered. The woman on the plane had been grey, shrunken, hiding inside her own coat. This Cynthia was radiant. She wore a tailored cream blazer and dark trousers. Her hair was cut in a chic, modern bob. She stood with her shoulders back. She looked 10 years younger. "Mrs. Vance," Julian said, standing up immediately and offering a genuine smile. "Or is it still Mrs. Vance?" "Just Cynthia, please." She smiled, taking his hand. I went back to my maiden name. But honestly, Cynthia is enough. It feels like I'm a new person anyway. You look incredible, Julian said. London suits you. I love it here, she said, sitting opposite him. I bought a small flat in Chelsea. I spend my days going to galleries, taking French lessons and just breathing. I never realized how hard it was to breathe before. She looked down at her hands. I wanted to thank you, Julian. I sent a letter to your office, but I don't know if you got it. I get about 1,000 letters a day, Julian admitted. But if I had seen yours, I would have answered. I wanted to thank you for the upgrade, she said. Not just to first class. You upgraded my life. When you stood up to him, when you showed him that his money didn't give him the right to be cruel, it woke me up. I had been sleepwalking for 20 years. Julian nodded slowly. Sometimes we need a shock to break the pattern. I'm just sorry you had to go through that public spectacle to get there. It was worth it, Cynthia said firmly. The divorce was messy, but I'm free. I actually started a foundation. Oh, the Flight 902 Fund, she said. It provides legal aid and support for service workers who are harassed or abused by customers. We help flight attendants, waitresses, retail staff, people who can't fight back. I'm using Preston's money to do it. Julian laughed, a deep, rich laugh that turned heads in the lounge. That is poetic justice, Cynthia. Using his fortune to protect the people he looked down on. Marcus Aurelius would be proud. I read it, by the way, she said, pulling a small paperback from her bag. Meditations? You were reading it on the plane. I bought a copy the day I landed in London. And waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one, she quoted. My favorite line, Julian smiled. Their conversation was interrupted by a news flash on the silent TV mounted on the wall. The headline read, Former Logistics CEO files for bankruptcy. They both looked at the screen. There was a photo of Preston Vance leaving a courthouse. He looked disheveled, unshaven, defeated. Cynthia watched the screen for a moment. There was no malice in her eyes, only a distant pity. She looked like someone watching a storm from the safety of a warm house. Do you feel sorry for him? Julian asked softly. I feel sorry that he never learned, Cynthia said. He had everything, Julian. He had money. He had influence. He had a wife who was loyal to a fault. And he threw it all away because he couldn't stand the idea of a black man in a hoodie having a better seat than him. She took a sip of her tea. He built his own cage. I just finally walked out of it. Flight 902 is now boarding for New York JFK, the announcer's voice chimed softly. Julian checked his watch. That's me. You're heading back? Always, Julian said. I have an airline to run. We're launching a new route to Ghana next month. I want to make sure the service is perfect. I'm sure it will be, Cynthia said. They stood up. Julian hesitated, then extended a hand. Cynthia bypassed it and hugged him. It was a brief, professional hug, but it carried the weight of two survivors acknowledging each other. Safe travels, Mr. Thorne, she said. And you, Cynthia. Enjoy the view. Julian picked up his bag, the same battered leather weekender, and walked toward the gate. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew the world was correcting itself, one flight at a time. As he boarded the plane, he greeted the flight attendant by name. He walked past row 1. Mr. Thorne, seat 1A is ready for you, the purser said. Julian paused. He looked at the luxurious suite. Then he looked back at row 35, back in economy. He saw a young mother struggling with a baby and 2 heavy bags, trying to get settled in a cramped middle seat. "Actually," Julian said, handing his boarding pass to the purser. "Give 1A to her, the mother in 35B. Tell her it's a system error and she's been upgraded." "But sir, where will you sit?" Julian smiled, pulling his hoodie up. "I'll take 35B. I need to finish my book anyway." He walked back to economy, squeezed into the middle seat, and put on his noise-cancelling headphones. The world outside continued its chaotic spin, but inside the cabin, and inside Julian Thorne, there was only silence. And silence, as he knew better than anyone, was the loudest sound of all. And that is the incredible true story of how one moment of arrogance can destroy a lifetime of success. Preston Vance thought his net worth gave him the right to belittle others, but he learned the hard way that true character isn't defined by the seat you're in. It's defined by how you treat the people serving you. Julian Thorne didn't just win because he was the CEO. He won because he kept his cool while the other man lost his mind. It's a brutal reminder. You never know who you're talking to, so treat everyone with respect. What would you have done if you were in Julian's shoes? Would you have revealed who you were earlier, or would you have let him dig his own grave just like that? I want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's get a debate going. If you enjoyed this story of instant karma and justice, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss the next crazy real-life story. Thanks for watching. And remember, stay humble, or life will humble you for you.